All right, friends, welcome back. With you, as always, I am Charlie William Parks, but not always with me. We have Dr. Eric Trexler here today. I am honored to be speaking to you, sir. You have your PhD and are a postdoctoral research associate in the Duke University Department of Evolutionary Anthropology. That's like a little bit of a tongue twister for me, but you're probably used to saying it. Much of your work in health and wellness comes from a holistic perspective, which I also really love. Hearing you talk a lot. I've listened to you talk and read a bunch of your stuff already, by the way, so I feel like I know you probably more than this weird guy who you're talking to. You're actively involved with sports science research, in particular the Mass Research Review. I'm a subscriber, love it. If you're watching this at home, get on it. You will not be disappointed. Dr. Trexler does a lot of work regarding metabolism research. You're a natural pro bodybuilder and coach, also very cool. Hope we get to talk about that a little bit. And I think the thing you're probably most known for, of course, is the Iron Culture podcast. Would you agree?
Definitely, yeah.
Also with that Helms guy, who I really enjoy. I think he's an awesome dude as well. First of all, like I said earlier, thank you so much for speaking with me today and coming on the show, Dr. Trexler.
Yeah, it's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Rock on, man. I'm very excited to talk to you. So first thing I want to ask is what's new and exciting? What are you up to?
Staying busy. Obviously the Mass Research Review, always making content over there, covering the newest fun studies. I really like that because as a researcher, it's very hard to dramatically shift gears, especially over short time courses, so you start doing a line of research and you're really doing that work for quite some time. Studies have multi-year timelines, etc. The nice thing about the Mass Research Review is every month I can look at a few of the coolest studies that came out, and even if I don't personally do research in that exact topic, as long as I feel comfortable critiquing the study, elaborating on it, and saying how it might be useful, it's a really nice way to engage in some research topics where I personally can't plan out a 3-year study, So staying busy with that, but then of course at Duke, doing my research in evolutionary anthropology, doing my research in the Global Health Institute, doing a little bit with athletics with their new sports science, kind of innovation program that they're putting together. So
that's cool.
Yeah. So it's fun. I get to do a little bit of everything, and it spans across many departments, and it's a lot of fun.
That's fantastic. The Mass again is something that is such a plethora of information for those without their doctorate like myself. So it's always understandable, and 1,000% I recommend that everyone checks that out. So before we get too sciencey, I want to talk about the metabolic stuff with you and some recent studied stuff as well. But I wanted to ask you, you doing natural pro bodybuilding, did an interest in bodybuilding lead you towards science or vice versa, or is it just kind of how you ended up?
It's interesting. So an interest in generally being jacked, or trying to, the pursuit of
jackness.
That got me into science. And so there was a time there where I was interested in science, but did not actually intend to go step on stage as a bodybuilder. But I think then, as a scientist, I thought bodybuilding was a really cool way to actually start applying what I had been learning and kind of take it to the furthest extreme I could. So yeah, it was like being generally interested in fitness got me into science, and then being in science got me into bodybuilding, which is why, you mentioned Eric Helms. He and I have talked about this publicly, but like Eric Helms loves bodybuilding. I love physiology.
That's cool.
So he loves bodybuilding per se. He loves the sport as an art form and an expression and a competitive endeavor. I could do without, frankly, a lot of the pageantry and things. Like I've always said, in my opinion, a bodybuilding show should last about 15 minutes. You line up, you do the mandatories, and before you're off stage, they pick a winner, because it really isn't that hard, right? But yeah, so we just come at it from different angles. But I like bodybuilding because it's a way to kind of see how the body pushes against these really extreme conditions and those responses really have been very carefully, although somewhat randomly, kind of molded by the forces of evolution over time. So it's really cool to see not just what happens, but also to understand why and how. It's a really fun experience.
There's almost like a sculpting aspect of it, I feel, too. Just the layering of the clay. And I'm an artist, so you'd see some of this crap behind me. But, the layering of the clay and then the cutting it down as well. I think that was certainly something that stimulated my mind early about it as well. Pretty
definitely.
So your work has a particular emphasis and correlation on physical activity, nutrition, metabolism, stress. It's kind of your expertise. Metabolism, cardio, metabolic health, in particular at Duke, in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology. I see on the second time I can say it correctly. Can you talk a little bit more about what you do in the department, kind of what it entails in some more detail?
Yeah, so our lab is kind of, I would say, highly specialized. So I work in the Poncer lab at Duke. Herman Poncer is pretty well known in the fitness circles. And our lab is really focused on understanding human energy expenditure, specifically in terms of, the degree to which it can be modified and what seems to be driving those modifications. So if you talk, to people who are really interested in like evolutionary biology or evolutionary anthropology, there's a lot of interest in how organisms allocate energy to different physiological processes, right? So at any given time, there's the basic stuff of just keeping the lights on metaphorically in the body, keeping the tissues alive, that's going to require energy, breathing, heartbeats, kidneys working, liver working, brain working. But then there's also things like reproductive function, and there's things like immune function, and there's things like physical activity, and there's things like some of the kind of non-exercise movement that we do throughout the day. And so our lab is really focused on kind of understanding, when it comes to humans, to what degree does energy expenditure kind of vary from one person to another? How much does it vary when one person dramatically changes their behaviors or lifestyle? So even within person, how does it change? And what seems to be, how does our body essentially manage this energy budget and these competing priorities? And it's really interesting to see, humans, there are many things that make us special, but we still belong to the animal kingdom. And we are not alone in the sense that, if you're a bodybuilder, and if you talk to someone who's a bodybuilder who's gotten really, really lean, they may tell you, I had no libido. If they were a woman, maybe I lost my period for some amount of time. I was freezing cold and I got sick. I was more susceptible to just getting whatever was going around in terms of like upper respiratory stuff. And humans are not the only organisms that when we're in an environment or situation where there's insufficient energy to meet our needs, we start downregulating things like thyroid hormone, like our sex hormones, like reproductive functions. Our immune functions start to get kind of turned down a little bit. Our lab is really interested in understanding that process, but then also zooming out a little bit and understanding the clinical and real world implications of that. So that's where we kind of loop in our understanding of not just energy expenditure, but the broader elements of cardiometabolic health.
It's always fascinating to me to see, to your point, we're part of a much larger, species and whatnot. But then when you see them do studies on animal models and stuff like that, and kind of like there comes a point sometimes where I feel like the science has to say, this does occur in animals because of this, but it's totally like in terms of caloric deficits for longevity is a big one you hear about. It seems like it does not apply to a good health span, if you will, versus lifespan. Is that kind of...
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I'm glad you brought that up. I actually wrote a couple about this in the last couple of years, but For life extension, for example, the two most common interventions that you see in various animal models, one is going to be protein restriction, the other is going to be caloric restriction. And the research that we have so far seems to suggest that the promising findings of early protein restriction research don't really seem to be generalizable across species. And the closer you get to human, the sketchier it gets. So, like if you're a fruit fly, it's a great strategy for longevity. But it's really questionable about whether or not it even makes the jump to rodents. And certainly it doesn't seem to be an effective strategy for humans. And if anything, like you're alluding to, if you were going really extreme, and you'd have to go very extreme if you were even hoping to get any type of benefit, you would be setting yourself up for a really exaggerated form of sarcopenia, from that really severe protein restriction. So the net balance, the effect on your health and overall, and frankly, that would eventually impact your lifespan as well. Because if you are extremely sarcopenic and you fall and break a hip because you have poor muscularity, poor muscle force capability, the 1 year and 2 year survival rates of a broken hip, if you have advanced stage and sarcopenia, are shocking, extremely low. So and the other one that's really popular is in the animal model research is caloric restriction. And what's fascinating about that is you could imagine a scenario where you're doing resistance training and eating enough protein, but still doing some pretty severe caloric restriction, and perhaps there may be some benefit to be gained there in terms of longevity. However, number one, it would be very, very hard to maintain the level of restriction you need. Most people are unable to do it, and those who are able to do it will hate it. It will be a life it will be not the most enjoyable life, but you will get potentially more of it. But the other thing, the reason I say potentially is John Speakman, who I had the pleasure of collaborating with over the past year on a paper. He's brilliant. He's done more in science. I could never dare to dream to do an eighth of what he's done in science. Like, he is just absolutely a legend. But he has a great paper about caloric restriction as a longevity tool. And the reality is, if you are following the animal model research, the degree of restriction you have to do, you may put yourself in a position where you start to compromise immune function, or you start to compromise wound healing. And so now all of a sudden, you cut your thumb opening a can of beans, it gets infected, and you're in pretty bad shape. So it's not so simple. Yeah.
It kind of almost begs the question, or makes you think of it like, makes you almost visualize, like, if survival and health span are like these 5 pillars, and the caloric restriction is really boosting one of them. Let's say, who knows if it transfers over to your point, but like, to your point, if you fall and break your hip and you have no muscle mass now because you haven't eaten protein in 20 years, or infection, things like that. I mean, even evolutionarily, how about procreating? You're not going to have much testosterone or libido at 5% body fat, I would think.
Yeah, and I think that my kind of practical takeaway from the caloric restriction literature is that if you want to really maximize the combination of lifespan, health span, and enjoyment span, which to me is being able to really enjoy your lifestyle day in and day out, do the things you love, enjoy the kind of pleasures of life and the fun leisure time activities, and do those safely. I think what we can really learn from the caloric restriction literature is to avoid excess caloric intake. So I think the idea of keeping yourself at like 5% body fat as a male is probably not going to be conducive to a whole lot of health and happiness.
Yeah.
However, one of the things that our lab at Duke does is we do a lot of collaborations working with hunter-gatherer populations and other kind of small-scale subsistence farming populations. Basically, folks who your food, you made it, and it took a lot of physical effort, right? You're either tending to a small herd, doing some very small-scale farming just for subsistence, or you're in a hunter-gatherer community. And so I think generally like the benefit, so to speak, of leanness is probably more of what we're seeing in those populations, which are not 5% body fat, as a male. They're lean, and you do not see a lot of obesity in these populations, but they're not shredded, right?
Right,
So
right.
I think that's kind of where you want to be, is avoiding excess adiposity and avoiding chronic excess caloric intake, and the two go hand in hand.
Absolutely. That you mentioned earlier, talking about protein, longevity, things like that. I definitely want to ask you. You were just part of a study, the effect of dietary protein on fat-free mass in energy-restricted, resistance-trained individuals, because we know that's pretty important. Dr. Helms and Dr. Ruffalo are part of it as well. Can you talk a little bit about the purposes of that study? It seems to have reinforced a couple of really neat things.
Yeah. I mean, actually, there's just some Instagram posts about it today that are causing all sorts of questions and conversation.
This thing went controversial. We're trying to keep it not controversial. Oh no.
You can't talk about protein without someone getting upset, right? Because everyone in the fitness world kind of staked their claim to a specific recommendation, and if yours doesn't perfectly match it, then you are now contradicting them.
You can't buy their book if it does not conform. So I mean, fiber has been killing everyone for years. If you haven't heard.
Yeah. So basically, the reason it matters is because there's good reason to believe, and there's good evidence to support the idea that we can talk all day about how much protein you need to build muscle when you're eating plenty and you've got moderate body fat, you're in a positive energy balance and all that stuff. But it does appear that protein needs become particularly high when you are in this combination of scenarios where you have low body fat and you are actively in a caloric deficit and trying to lose fat as you go. So this type of thing really the reason that there's not a lot of research on it is because no one cares. This basically only applies to bodybuilders and fitness enthusiasts,
right,
who are trying to be like fairly shredded and muscular.
Was this the Manu Hensel? I'm not going to butcher his name. Manu Henselman article that just came out. Is that what it was?
I don't know if he wrote an article about it, but he
posted something.
He did post an Instagram post.
I saw it this morning. I saw it. I didn't see the chat though, which I'm sure was exciting.
Yeah, it was fairly critical of some of the interpretations of our study, and I do take issue with some of the ways it was presented. But
get it out. Here's this open forum.
I'll talk to Menno about it publicly so that people can kind of see the alternative interpretation. And I don't want to, Menno puts out a lot of great content. I've told him personally, I follow his content. It's one of the only like fitness oriented pages I follow regularly, just because whether I agree with his interpretation or not, he does a really good job finding the interesting stuff that's coming out, and so I've told him, I was like, there are many times that I read your posts and I fundamentally disagree with everything you took away from the paper, respectfully, but I still follow his page as a really solid resource, and more often than not, we do have a lot of common ground in terms of how we see the research. But basically, we did our study because Helms basically wanted to do this type of analysis many years ago, and he did publish a paper on the topic. But there just wasn't a lot of data to actually use for analysis and interpretation. So in the decade or so since, there's been more research that has come out that is pertinent and relevant to the research question. So we teamed up, me, Helms, and Martin Ruffalo, and Martin really led the project, to be clear. He put in by far the most effort and time, so he gets the vast majority of the credit here. But we basically wanted to update that analysis and look at, how much protein seems to be necessary for retaining fat-free mass during a diet if your body fat's pretty low. And what we found, I'll acknowledge, was surprising to me. But if you look at our data, the relationship between protein intake and the net change in fat-free mass was positive, but it also seemed to be fairly linear, which I did not expect. I would have thought that it really leveled off at a particular level. And that's really what's driving a lot of the controversy is I think people see that type of model and the results, and the results are basically, hey, there's a linear relationship and more proteins seem to be better. And so people get really frustrated with that because they're like, but if you're telling me more is always better, then I can never feel like I really had enough, or I feel this kind of pressure to do more and more and more.
Is that a psychological issue or a scientific issue or both?
In this particular situation, I think it's both. Definitely the psychological issue is what a lot of people are probably responding to. From a scientific perspective, I am curious. We just don't have the data, but I'd be really curious to see how different that looks if we use direct measures of actual muscle mass rather than fat-free mass. So for example, when people are really, really overloading the protein, is it possible that we're just getting some additional growth in non-muscle components of fat-free mass that is clinically irrelevant and irrelevant to your physique, but technically causing that to still go up by, a kilogram or something?
Are you talking organs, ligaments, tendons, cartilage? What do you mean like could actually be growing in that sense that wouldn't be?
Well, when we break down the body into two compartments, fat mass and fat-free mass.
Sure.
I mean, technically, I'm talking about literally everything in your
else.
body that is not skeletal muscle tissue or adipose tissue. That technically falls under that umbrella. And so things that can move the needle could be as simple as water retention, extra glycogen being stored in your liver or kidneys or muscles. Like there's all sorts of little fluctuating things that can impact fat-free mass. So yeah, I mean, I don't really have a strong hypothesis about what could be going on, but I think there was some work a few years ago, more than a few years ago, but they were looking at really, really high levels of protein overfeeding. And I think they found that even with like extremely large boluses of protein, that they found basically, if memory serves, I think they found kind of this continual increase in whole body muscle protein synthesis, but not so much in skeletal muscle protein synthesis. So the idea was, it looks like some proteins are being created, and I don't quite know what they are. But all that is to say, it does put people into a position that I can certainly empathize with, which is, well, if you're telling me more is always better, then how much is enough? And yeah.
Anecdotally, it's so interesting because I was the heavy kid growing up, bullied, was never naturally lean, and I maintain pretty low body fat now. I'm not ready to step on stage or anything, but I'm happy, I'm lean and all that stuff. And I have always found that whatever the model was, a gram per pound was always what you heard growing up. I'm almost 40. I don't know how old you are, but that's what I heard my life. And I always was eating not like significantly more than that. And I always found that I enjoyed eating protein, dairy, meat, fish, all that stuff. And for whatever reason, once I kind of figured out what I liked, my appetite was really kept in check, and I certainly was gaining muscle, if anything. I wasn't losing anything. So anecdotally, I've always found the more the better. But to your point, at what point, is there a point, if it's linear, that it's like, nah, I mean, listen, 5 grams per pound of body weight, it's a little too much, Charlie. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that there's a couple important considerations. So one is that the relationship stayed pretty linear within the range of intakes we looked at, but we didn't look at the full spectrum of possible intakes, right? So it's not like we had studies where people were going up to like 5 and 6 and 7 grams per kilogram of body mass. So you could still assume, I would say, that whether from a physiological perspective or just a pragmatic or practical perspective, there will be some point where that relationship either flattens out, or you simply cannot either stomach that much protein at a certain intake level, or it'll just be impossible to still meet the criteria of being in a deficit just because the protein intake is so high. Absolutely. So all of that is to say, like, I'm not a protein maximalist, but at the same time, when you do a meta regression, what do you want me to do? Like, you calculate everything the way you said you were going to, and then you report what you found. So you don't really have any room to kind of put your thumb on the scale or put your fingerprints all over the analysis. You said what you were going to do, and then you do it. And so I was surprised that it was linear, but a couple caveats. Obviously, the effect size wasn't absolutely enormous in general. It's not like we saw huge discrepancies in fat-free mass retention when you compare, for example, 2 grams per kilogram to 4 grams per kilogram, right? So it's not like we're seeing massive effects. And at the end of the day, you're going to have trade-offs in your diet where the higher you go with protein, the lower you have to go with something else, especially when we're talking in the context of caloric restriction. So even in our paper, we say this doesn't mean that more protein is always better, because you have to then do the cost-benefit analysis of, for me to work more protein in my diet and stay in this deficit, what is that going to cost me in terms of fat restriction and carbohydrate restriction? Now, here's one thing I will say. There are a couple critiques that I saw about the analysis. And one of the things that kind of drove me nuts was a comparison to the Morton meta-analysis and meta-regression from 2018.
Okay.
And this was the kind of classic paper where for the most part, this is like the origin of the idea that people should have 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass, which has been kind of the rallying cry of evidence-based fitness for the last decade or so. And there are some, I really reject the concept of that analysis was good, our analysis is weird, so let's go with the first one that seemed to kind of fit what we already believe to be true. So that Morton analysis was done by a fantastic team of researchers, and they're all very, very good at what they do, but there are some statistical quirks about that modeling. I don't know the extent to which your audience is going to be thrilled to hear a stat talk, but
that's what we do.
The confidence interval of the break point, where the kind of practical interpretation of that is, here's where you've maximized the benefits of your protein intake, so it doesn't make sense to go any higher. First of all, the break point was non-significant, which normally would mean that you just model the data without a break point, which means you would keep it linear. So even in that paper, the relationship, if you were just doing the stats by the book, it still should have been modeled in a linear relationship. Now they chose to use the breakpoint analysis and say that, okay, here's where enough is enough, and their estimate is 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass. The confidence interval for that ranged essentially the entire spectrum of their data. So from 1 all the way up to 2.2 grams per kilogram. And I think all of their data, the lowest possible protein intake was like 0.8, and the highest protein intake within that sample was like 2.3-ish, 2.4. So basically, all that breakpoint analysis tells you is we are going to insist that there is a breakpoint here, even though technically we shouldn't, and that breakpoint is somewhere between where the data begins and where the data ends, which is not a very informative breakpoint.
So you're saying if it was continued, it could have been linear?
I'm saying that the statistical test indicated that it ought to have been treated as linear.
Interesting.
Yeah. And to their credit, they reported that in the paper, that they acknowledged that. They said the breakpoint for this was not significant, basically indicating we should have just kept it linear.
Yeah, that's really super interesting too, because it almost seems like, based on what you're saying around the study, it's becoming where almost like cognitive dissonance is starting to creep in for some people who maybe it doesn't conform to their whatever that package is they're selling. But at the end of the day, the thing I love about science is it's not politics, it's data. This is the data. This is what the data says. First thing you said was, I was surprised. Like you were like, I was surprised, But,
at the same time, if I may, like the group that did that paper by Morton and colleagues, they followed up a handful of years later with a paper by Nunes and colleagues, and they did a similar kind of meta-regression, and that meta-regression model had much more favorable statistical characteristics. It kind of corrected a lot of the shortcomings of the prior model, and that was presented as a linear model with no breakpoint. It just more protein, more fat-free mass. And so I understand why people intuitively feel like that doesn't seem true. But at the same time, like I don't know what to tell you. You gather the data, you model it, and if the numbers keep going up, they keep going up. So at the end of the day, I think people want to be told, well, you tell me at some point enough is enough, because now I need to bring in my carbohydrate, my fat, and all that stuff.
Right.
And what we're telling you is, we understand as practitioners that a diet is holistic in nature. It has multiple macronutrients. And so you can't just go up and up and up and up with protein. But what this does tell us is, you probably, if you're in this position and you want to do every little thing you can do to maintain every last bit, every last gram of muscle, or I should be clear, fat-free mass, then probably you want to err on the side of making sure you're getting plenty of protein, even if it means dropping the carbs and fat a little bit within reason.
I had put out a video a couple of weeks ago about maintaining a low body fat and how I just naturally kind of do it. And one of the things was, I actually said I eat a little too much protein, meaning what they kind of recommend. Before the study came out, mind you, I'm eating a little more. It kind of reminds me too with, the anecdotal stuff you would hear from bodybuilders who were like the obviously enhanced, but like the biggest dudes ever. And even the way they would train sometimes versus scientifically, you look at, okay, hypertrophy occurs when you have like the full range of motion, slowing the eccentric, full ROM, all this awesome stuff, which I do. And then you see like a bodybuilder who's the biggest, most jacked dude ever, just like flailing these monstrous weights around. You're like, well, it kind of works for him. I mean,
yeah,
yeah.
So absolutely, yeah. There's all sorts of scenarios where I think that really gets back to the general point here of why we do all this stuff, which is that we don't do research to handcuff you to a strategy you hate.
Right.
We don't do research to set the strict guardrails of what you can or cannot do. We do research to try to inform our decisions about what we're going to do with our training and nutrition. And there may be situations where, for example, what you just brought up, which is like, we've all seen just the dude who's just been throwing weights around for many, many years and is really jacked. And let's assume we know for sure that performance enhancing drugs are not part of the picture, right? Because I know plenty of folks who they're just really jacked. I know they're natural, and their training practices do not conform to what we would call kind of scientific best practices. The reality is, if you kind of think through this more academically in terms of effect sizes, because like I said, if you're worried about your protein intake for muscle growth and you're not worried about the what your training program looks like, you're way out of whack. The training program is going to have a much more substantial impact, right? So it's not just what is the relationship, it's what is the relationship and what is the relative importance. And I would argue that if you show me someone who is just sick in the head, and what I mean by that in the best possible way is they freaking love lifting. They love breaking a sweat. They love putting in effort. They love feeling the burn, and they want to be in the gym 6 or 7 days a week.
Now I'm starting to feel bad about myself as you're saying. I'm like, he's calling me sick.
If all I know about a person is that, and I know that they're going to be doing that for 4 years, I don't need to know that much about their training program. They'll figure it out.
Right.
They'll figure something out that works. And I think sometimes we put way too much emphasis on these really granular changes in exercise technique or training program composition, and we don't put quite enough emphasis on just falling in love with lifting and doing it with a high level of effort and intention day in and day out, because that is what I know to separate really jacked people from everybody else, is that they're just crazy about it.
I think one of the things that the science really helps, even if you're going to figure it out on your own, is a lot of the things you and the other people I respect and encourage so much works to help prevent injury, where you might figure it out without using some of these principles, but you're a whole lot more likely to get hurt, kind of throwing the weights around that maybe you can't lift. Absolutely.
And if I may, I think another benefit of it is, You don't have to do exactly what some study says, and no researcher worth their weight in salt would actually tell you that that's how research should be applied or interpreted. But I think a big benefit of research is that it helps you not have to try literally every combination possible, right? So like it just gives you the basic framework from which to operate and experiment and find what you like. So for example, you could go into the gym and say, well, I could do a completely isometric training program, or I could do eccentric focus or concentric focus, or partial range of motion in the shortened muscle position, or partial range of motion in the lengthened position, or full range of motion. There's so many different ways before you even sit down on a bench press where you'd say, how there are a million permutations of how I could move this bar, or in the case of isometrics, not move this bar.
Not move the bar.
And so I think research helps you kind of build those fundamentals of like, hey, you don't need to try to do 100 sets per week of muscle group, because it looks like 10 to 20 is usually plenty of sets per muscle group per week. And if you want to go up to 40, that seems plausible, but going beyond that doesn't seem all that helpful. So we're just giving you ranges. Train each muscle group 2, maybe 3 times a week. Hit each muscle group 10 to 20, maybe up to 40 sets per week if you really feel like it. Generally focus on full range of motion with concentric and eccentric muscle actions. If you want to bias the lengthened muscle position to some extent, that may be helpful. But we're filling in the really big stuff so that your experimentation doesn't have to encompass every possible permutation of ways to lift weights. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. The other thing that I find fantastic about the study you did, where the relationship was linear regarding the protein and retaining the muscle mass, is you made a really good point before. At some point, you're dipping into carbs. You start dipping into carbs. I'm sorry, I'm just not on the other bandwagon. You're dipping into your training. That's the preferred source of energy and all that good stuff. You start dipping into the training quality. I've never got into 5% body fat. I can't imagine what that's like for those pros. I think it's amazing you guys have done that. I'm pretty lean, but I know you take my carbs away, my training is going. And if I'm trying to retain mass at a real caloric deficit, that has to impact how much muscle I can, forget about even build, but keep, would you say?
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize as well that like in this particular meta regression, we did have a kind of a cutoff point where we said, you have to be below this body fat to be included, because we didn't want to include the kind of typical weight loss study where people maybe start with a BMI of 35 or whatever,
Okay. What would you say the body fat percentage was? I'm sorry to interrupt. What would you say the body fat percentage was?
I'd have to double check because we had a different one for males or females. It wasn't shredded. I can tell you that.
Okay.
I can bring up the paper the next time you ask a question and find it. I have it right here. But anyway, yeah. So people were lean-ish, but they were not shredded, because if we restricted the data set to only people who are absolutely shredded, there would be virtually no data. Right?
Yeah.
Like there's just not that much research on it.
Not to mention how many bodybuilders that are like 6 weeks out want to be, messing around,
It just doesn't happen. And so the reason that's important is because, like you said, I mean, if I'm going into the gym with 20% body fat and my carbs are low, I can get by. Like that's my experience as a person who, at one point in my life, I bulked up to like 200 pounds, and then after that, I cut down to 135, and I've been everywhere in between. Like, wow. I know what high body fat feels like. I know what low body fat feels like. When I have higher body fat, I'm very resilient to those kind of little tiny fluctuations in energy availability and carbohydrate availability. But if I'm really, really lean, and I'm starting to make those carbohydrate sacrifices, I feel it big time in the gym. And the wheels really fall off in terms of my training quality. And so I did find the number here. So the body fat percentage cutoff points, basically we had to restrict it so that males had to be below 27.8% body fat. To be in this study, and females had to be below 39.7. Those are the absolute upper limits. Most people were comfortably below those. Yeah. But we basically used that based on a different study involving some normative.
So these
data.
weren't shredded folks.
They were not shredded folks, but what we were trying to get at was capture all the studies with fairly athletic individuals who were still engaged in volitional weight loss programs. So this would be more applicable to your typical fitness enthusiast, not your person who says, hey, my doctor told me I had to lose 20 pounds because I'm pre-diabetic, etc. So that's kind of how we approach the question. And so I think while you could say, hey, that having the cutoffs that high is a limitation if we're talking about what a shredded bodybuilder should do, very true. But it also increases our generalizability to the typical fitness enthusiast who's saying, hey, I want to go from, a fairly athletic build to pretty lean. What do I need to do in terms of my protein intake? And we do provide some recommendations in the paper that are not as much as you could possibly consider eating, right? Like we actually do give some more realistic recommendations. So for example, if you're going based on total body mass, we recommend, I think I'll have to double check the paper and see exactly what our kind of recommendation table looks like, but we don't just say like, hey, do as much as you can possibly consume. We basically say, there seem to be these linear effects up to this point, basically representing the full range of our data. But make sure you consider those trade-offs when it comes to carbohydrate and fat. And I know for me personally, going into the study, I typically would tell people I like to scale by grams per kilogram of fat-free mass rather than total body mass. A lot of people think that's annoying. I understand why, because it's an extra step and it involves estimation. However, as a person, I like recommendations that can scale from the 98-pound bikini competitor up to the 412-pound person whose doctor said they needed to lose some weight. I want everyone to be able to use these protein recommendations, and if you scale it by total body mass, you have no shot, right?
I'm going to ask you a potentially poorly worded question because as I'm listening to you, this is coming to me. So if this doesn't make sense, probably doesn't make sense. Is it even, if you were to look at lower-ish body fat people, not shredded people or anything like that, but is the potential for recomp or really pulling calories from elsewhere a bit lower versus when you have the higher body fats where the data almost has to be more reflective of what you're consuming in your mouth because there's just not so many fat stores to pull from, whether it's building muscle or holding on to muscle in a study like this? Does that make any sense?
100%. Yeah. If you have more body fat, you definitely have a greater opportunity for recomposition. So yeah, I always tell people like, hey, if your body fat's really high, and I actually do build that into like, in the past I've made some products that give protein recommendations and have to be scalable for just about anybody. And I'm working on current projects that do the same thing. And basically what I like to do is scale the protein recommendation to fat-free mass in kilograms, but I put an upper limit on that. So that for people who have tremendously high recomp potential, basically we're not just like way overfeeding them protein that they don't need. Yeah. So like for example, I usually recommend to people, if you're not in a deficit, you want to maximize hypertrophy, between 2 and 2.75 grams of protein per kilogram of fat-free mass per day. And if you're really, really lean and you're dieting, then you might consider going up to 3.1 or perhaps even slightly higher grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, not total body mass. But I usually, whenever I do that type of thing, I kind of set a cap of like the highest fat-free mass I will possibly acknowledge or kind of recognize within those calculations is X, and I forget exactly where I typically set that. I've written some code, like some programs that kind of, I think, cap that, usually with fat-free mass values up in the somewhere between the high 80s and maybe 100 kilograms of fat-free mass. Because again, there's no point in kind of way overfeeding in an absolute sense.
Kind of feel like if you were coaching someone versus in regard to bulking them or something like that, the overfeeding I guess comes more to play. But the neat thing about kind of gaintaining, like Helms and I talked about a bit, was just like Protein is satiating, man. And, yeah, maybe if you're like, I don't know, the McDonald's getting the crispy chicken or something, you can pound those, but I can only eat so much chicken breast, and I can eat, and I like to eat, but, okay, a gram, now I'm using pounds because that's just, Americans. Gram and a half, a pound for me is like, I can go there. I can do that with pretty much ease. You go much beyond that, and it's like, where am I going to get the protein without the other calories, without the other fat? Like, what am I going to do? Like, just, Rocky drinking egg whites? I don't know. It seems like your body almost has a little bit of like a emergency brake when it comes to consuming too much of that, at least.
Yeah, definitely. And, I do want to mention before it escapes my mind, you talked a little bit about the effect of body fat percentage. And, for any kind of recommendation, when we looked at the modeling, we looked at the relationship between protein, grams per pound of body weight, and fat-free mass values, and we did find that the slope of that relationship, was larger for people that had low body fat, and as you got from low body fat to medium to high, that relationship became much flatter. In other words, it wasn't really as critical when the body fat reached the higher end of the range we're talking about in this study. So
that was kind of what I was alluding to, assuming without understanding.
Yeah, and that the same was true actually, even when we did scale by fat-free mass as well. So it really is, a fat mass thing that that when your body fat is higher, you have a little more wiggle room. You don't have to go quite as aggressive with the protein, but the leaner you get, especially when you're in a deficit, you definitely do want to make sure that you're getting plenty of that protein in.
For athletes, I mean, again, for the general population, hey, good rule of thumb is as you're getting leaner, make sure you're getting enough protein because your body can't pull from nothing. But for athletes looking at this, I mean, some wrestlers, right? You wrestled, I believe?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, wrestlers, I think you were a wrestler that had to go up in weight versus down in weight. Is that correct?
I had to do both.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That sucks.
Yeah. It was funny. At different points in my career, I wrestled at a school with a really, really competitive program. A lot of really great wrestlers came in and out. And so, especially in my younger years, it was like, we got a senior at this weight, that weight, that weight, that weight, and you're going to have to fit yourself in wherever you can.
Oh,
so
shit.
There was one year where I probably should have been wrestling about 130, and I ended up wrestling at 160.
Oh.
And it was like, in order for them to even like let me wrestle, I think I had to weigh in at like 152.1. Like I had to like technically make the weight class. So when everyone was on the bus to our tournaments, everyone's like dehydrated, they're hungry, they're pissed off, like everyone's in a bad mood. And I would actually be the opposite. I'd be like,
you've got like the dollar menu with you, the whole dollar menu.
And I will say this though, like I was, again, having been in both of those scenarios, I was just as miserable when I was trying to, because you're on like a 45-minute bus ride and you have literally eaten and drank to the point that you feel like you're going to explode.
Oh my God.
Very uncomfortable. So yeah, I've been in both sets of shoes and I didn't quite like either.
I had one Thanksgiving with the family. I met, I think, my wife's in-laws or the aunt or something. And I generally eat well and all that stuff. And this one Thanksgiving, I went too far. I just went off the rails. And it's not that I don't enjoy things during the day. I eat foods I like every day. I have a great, I'm very happy. But for whatever reason, I went too far. And I remember being in like the living room when everyone else is sitting for dessert, just walking in circles because I'm so cramped. Yeah. And I'm just like, wow. I'm like, I guess I can kind of see where you're coming from, where like sometimes too much is just too much.
Yeah.
Especially your body wanted to be the 130s. They're like gaining 30 pounds. What are you, a lineman? That's nuts.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to move like a wrestler? How do you move like a wrestler and do that?
And I will say, gaining 30 pounds is hard, but when you weigh 130, it's like a sixth of your body weight or like a fifth of your body weight. So It was very uncomfortable to do that and I had like no time to do it. So yeah, so like wrestling ultimately got me really interested in a lot of the stuff I research now, in the sense that just the need to dramatically alter body composition in a fairly short time scale starts to make you think a little bit about, what are the more kind of extreme
Yeah.
extreme boundaries of what we can do with nutrition and exercise.
Well, regarding your research, so much of it has been about metabolic adaptation. What has been the most useful thing that you've learned, that you've been able to kind of apply to your own training and coaching, that's kind of like the thing that you were the guiding light of sorts?
I think, in a simple statement, the fact that energy expenditure is malleable, it's adaptive. It changes and adapts to the circumstances we put upon it. And I think that's a huge deal because, you know, a lot of folks will be dieting and they'll run into a situation where things start to get tough. And sometimes it's really easy to convince yourself, I've reached the end of the road. Like, my body will not allow me to go further than this point. And even if I try harder, I will simply not be able to break through this plateau. I think over the years studying metabolic adaptation and now studying exercise energy compensation, I think the most important thing that I've learned is there will be some friction along the way as energy expenditure adapts in a weight loss phase. However, that adaptive capacity is ultimately limited, which means it's friction, it's not a brick wall. We can push through it. We will have to make more incremental changes, but the number of folks who I've worked with who it's like the minute that they reach some of that friction and weight loss starts to stall a little bit, it's right to the kind of the usual concerns. And it's not to discredit these concerns, because I can definitely empathize with them. But nonetheless, you do find a lot of folks who, right when they hit that first bit of friction, they start to say, I think maybe I have some kind of endocrine issue. I think I have a thyroid issue. I think it's something to do with carbohydrate or insulin, or, maybe I'm insulin resistant. And that's, there's all these kind of panicked suggestions that, like, there might be something going on here that requires a pretty substantial medical intervention, or maybe we're just at the end of the road. And I think it's been really informative to start unraveling, what the friction is, why it occurs, and more importantly, what is the actual magnitude of it, and to what extent can it be overcome. And the reality is, no matter how your metabolic rate and energy expenditure seem to be adapting, I always tell people, like, I understand it's annoying. I understand it's unfortunate. We will have to reduce our calories more, but the phrase I always use is everybody has a number. Every single person, wherever they're at in life, there is a number where we can set their calories to get them to the target rate of weight loss that we want. As long as we have a smart target rate of weight loss in mind,
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
And so that's what I always tell my clients over the years is everyone has a number. We just have to find yours. And then the question is, once we find it, how do we feel about that?
Right.
Because I have run into situations where I say, okay, we just got to find your number. We find their number, and they say, now that I know what it's going to take for me to lose weight at this rate, and I see what that diet looks like, I don't want to do this. And I say that I wouldn't either. I totally agree. So let's take a slower rate of weight loss, and let's find your new number, which is going to be a little bit more sustainable.
So, anecdotal little story, and then I want you to tell me why I'm right or wrong.
Sure.
I was, genetically the heavy kid. I've lost about a total of, I'm about 50 pounds lighter than my heaviest, probably 60 pounds of fat, because there was definitely recomp going on at the same time. I always found anecdotally, and I know body weight set point is not something that's talked about so much anymore, but it seemed to me like the more I did it and I got comfortable with a certain body fat, it was almost like I gave my body some time. I went into maintenance, or my body would be like, okay, we're not dying. Like, okay, we're not dying. And I was heavy. It wasn't like I was going from 15 to 12% body fat. I always found like doing it in stages, not just to let yourself recover hormonally or to deload or go into maintenance. It always seemed to me like the longer I took with it, and the more I was eating, I found at a time that I wasn't eating enough, and I would just keep yo-yoing, and the rubber band would happen. Where 6 days you go strong, and that Saturday night you'd ruin it. Is there a such thing? I'm almost thinking of muscle memory, which I've experienced. I got very sick with Lyme disease. I couldn't train for a long time. It was like almost deflated and inflated. Is there? I know it's a long question. I'm sorry. Is there any evidence that our body becomes more comfortable with losing fat, or our metabolism almost understands like we've experienced this before, we can do it again? Or is that just bonkers?
I am not familiar with any. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But yeah, I think, when people, well, one of the things that could be working in your benefit, the idea of getting more comfortable along the way, if you get to a body fat level and just chill there for a while, and then you keep going from there. One benefit can certainly be behavioral, in the sense of like you get to a body fat level, you kind of adjust to those sets of habits and behaviors, you adjust to that energy intake, it becomes your new normal. And even if there's no physiology going on, there's still a lot going on there from a behavioral perspective and a psychological perspective, where you feel like, okay, I have fully caught my breath. I'm at a very comfortably sustainable place now, and I'm not at all intimidated or concerned about the idea of digging a little deeper and getting the ball rolling again.
Interesting.
So that certainly could be part of it. But yeah, it's an interesting question. And to be frank, I wouldn't be shocked if we learn a lot more about some of these basic weight loss questions in the years that follow, because of some of these advancements in pharmacological therapies.
Agonists, GLP-1 agonists, stuff like that?
Yeah, GLP-1 agonists, and then you add in the GIP co-agonist, and then you add in the glucagon triple agonist, which is kind of the newest wave. And I think we're going to start learning a lot more about what weight loss really looks like, and what success looks like, and what maintenance looks like. I think one of the most, I don't know like a good word to put on it, but one of the things that really baffles me, or kind of strikes me as just an alarming observation, is once these different types of agonists and co-agonists started getting into the hands of people, you started to actually see these articles warning about side effects. And there are real side effects of these drugs, but the side effects I was reading about were Ozempic face and Ozempic butt. And the thing that really struck me about it is people were like, what is happening from this strange drug that causes my face or my butt to look like this? And I'm like, we are so accustomed to extremely unsuccessful weight loss programs that we are attributing to Ozempic what is actually just what happens when a weight loss thing actually works.
When you lose a lot of weight and quickly.
Yeah, when you lose a lot of weight quickly, like your Ozempic face is not Ozempic face, it's rapid weight loss face. Same thing with Ozempic butt, and I just thought it was so incredible as someone who has watched all these fitness trends over the last couple decades, and we're so used to just seeing a new thing come along that turns out to be not very useful, not very effective, and so we just get used to this kind of revolving door of new strategy that gets hyped up, whether it's a supplement or whatever. It doesn't work that well. We forget about it, move on to the next one, and it really struck me when I started seeing those articles. Like this is a fundamentally different thing that is not just the newest weight loss fad on the block. Like this is, for my money's worth. And again, I will acknowledge that there are some potential side effects. Using these drugs is not something that should be frowned upon, but also shouldn't be taken lightly. With any pharmacological intervention, you should absolutely understand the risks and the benefits. But without being hyperbolic, I think this is the biggest the biggest advancement in obesity research since we discovered leptin.
Wow.
Which a lot of people think we discovered leptin like 100 years ago. It was in the 90s, but it was either the 80s or 90s, but I'm pretty sure it was the 90s. But yeah, this is by far, in my opinion, the biggest advancement since that.
Why couldn't we just drink leptin and solve the weight loss issue with that?
So a funny thing.
That's a joke.
No, but a funny thing about leptin is that I assume that it must be hard or expensive to produce, and maybe it has a very bad profile in terms of side effects. I don't understand the kind of regulatory or market forces that prevent it from being a viable intervention. But you asked me about metabolic adaptation, and metabolic adaptation, you know me, I like to equivocate, I like to add a million caveats. I feel really comfortable saying metabolic adaptation is caused by low leptin, straight up. And in the studies that have observed people with metabolic adaptation and the whole kind of syndrome that goes with it, low thyroid, low sex hormones, on and on down the list, they found that if you just give them exogenous leptin injections, metabolic adaptation is solved. Energy expenditure, thyroid hormone, and the thing that's really incredible is if you think about, it's one thing getting. Let's say someone comes in and they've been underfed for a long time and they have low thyroid hormone, low testosterone, low estrogen, and so on and so forth. If we want to help them recover their sex hormones or recover their thyroid hormone, it's actually pretty simple. We keep an eye on their training volume, we start gradually refeeding them, and it comes back in a pretty timely manner. The one thing that is really finicky and really hard to restore is a regular menstrual cycle. So there's been case studies on female physique athletes who compete in figure, natural drug-free athlete, and I think their menstrual cycle went away during contest prep, which is actually fairly typical. It took 72 weeks for it to come back, and they were above, I believe, the weight at which they began their prep by the time it came back. Whereas a lot of the other stuff was restored literally months and months and months and months before that. But the reason I bring that up is there's also a study where they found a bunch of amenorrheic and oligomenorrheic lean women who had all these menstrual irregularities, and leptin was a remarkably effective intervention for restoring those menstrual cycles.
I have to ask you, baby, are people taking exogenous leptin? Are the bodybuilders taking leptin not to deal with fatigue while they're cutting? I mean, is that a thing?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know anything. There could be a whole underground market for leptin that I'm not aware of, but I just interact with the research literature, and you don't see a lot of interventions that use it. But the ones that have, it seems to be really effective for these types of things. I assume that it's prohibitively expensive or just has a poor profile in terms of adverse events. I think when leptin was first discovered, there was a lot of fanfare and optimism about using it as a weight loss tool, and the idea was not to attenuate some of these side effects of successful weight loss, which is ultimately what metabolic adaptation is. A lot of people were hoping we could give leptin to a person with obesity and it would cause them to lose weight. So that was the hope and the premise, was that we give people a bunch of leptin and the brain senses that, appetite goes down, movement goes up, etc. Unfortunately, shortly after all this fanfare and optimism, we started to recognize that doesn't really make sense because people with obesity already have really high leptin.
Right.
And that's when we started to figure out, leptin leads to a situation where you can have poor receptor sensitivity. So just like we can become insulin resistant when we develop obesity, we also become leptin resistant. So even though you have a ton of insulin, around in circulation in your blood, it's not actually initiating the cellular response with those receptors the way it used to. And the same thing is true with leptin. When you have obesity, your leptin is typically through the roof, but those receptors in your hypothalamus are not getting the same cellular response from it. So I do wonder that I should add a third potential. Maybe it's prohibitively expensive. Maybe it's prohibitively hard to get. Maybe it's prohibitively unsatisfactory in terms of adverse effects. Or maybe if you use it for a little bit, you just develop resistance to it and it stops working. So I'm not really sure about the idea of doing because usually like the studies where they're, for example, trying to restore the menstrual cycle, they're doing that exogenous leptin plus structured refeeding with the goal of actually regaining some body weight. So there's multiple elements to that intervention, and the idea would be that the exogenous leptin is removed once that person has a restored menstrual cycle, a healthy body fat level, and adequate energy availability.
So, like, theoretically, this leptin, specifically leptin resistance, is one of the things I most wanted to speak to you about. And theoretically, like, if you're really almost like comparing to insulin, is it possible that people who are not very, very obese, who maybe have adequate leptin levels, a bodybuilder who diets down, could benefit from the leptin because he hasn't blown out his leptin receptors over so many years, versus someone where it's like, hey, if you get to be this big, the leptin's not going to work? Could that be a thing?
I suspect that even for the people who have developed leptin resistance, I suspect that it's reversible, as is, insulin resistance within certain parameters. I would expect that you can kind of build back your leptin resistance, if I had to guess, or your leptin sensitivity, I should say. But to the other part of your question, absolutely. Like someone who is lean and dieting, because the things that cause leptin to go down are, you have lower body fat and you're actively in a caloric deficit. Both of those things independently cause drops in leptin. And a lesser known fact is that cortisol actually inhibits the biological activity of leptin. So usually with a bodybuilder, they're not just lean and dieting. Bodybuilders have
stressed out of their minds.
There's a certain personality type, right? Like they're just like permanently ramped up to 11, no matter what they're dealing with in life,
And you introduce anabolics to that, I can only imagine.
Yeah. So that would be a prime candidate who, frankly, would take exogenous leptin and say, I feel like a different human being. So again, I have no idea why it's not used. That's not to say it should be. Not a recommendation at all, because I don't understand its adverse effect profile.
Disclaimer, if you're watching this, please do not find an underground lab where they do not start injecting yourself with leptin. We don't want to become like the new bath salt people. That could be dangerous, I imagine.
Yeah, don't do that, because I literally have no idea what will happen to you.
It is fascinating, though, that like, hey, this thing does that. You could theorize it could work, could not work, but I'm just surprised, to your point, you would know better than I that there's not more research regarding it for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, the research, though, like I said, like there is more than a few studies where people have dieted, they've lost weight, their leptin is low, they replace it exogenously, and a lot of the stuff that we consider really annoying or unfavorable about metabolic adaptation, it does get reversed pretty promptly. So that research exists, and I frankly don't know why people haven't really followed through with drug development, other than the fact that that's just such a unique case and it's not really clinically all that relevant.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. It's a fascinating topic.
It is absolutely fascinating. Would you say that dieting might be the best way to improve insulin sensitivity? I'm sorry, leptin sensitivity?
I would say probably that's my best guess for both is that, yeah, getting to a lower body fat, something that, might fall within more of a kind of, recommended BMI range, and then trying to maintain that over time, staying active. Like, if I had to guess, I would basically follow the same book that I'd follow, the same playbook as I would for insulin sensitivity, restoring that, which is be active, lose some weight, eat a well-rounded, healthy diet, and do that for an extended period of time. And so I do want to acknowledge there is, I don't want to get too speculative, but there is some possibility that this has some relation to what you described previously with that idea of like, hey, I feel this kind of like muscle memory-ish thing where if I get to a lower body fat and I maintain it for a while, I start to feel pretty comfortable with that body weight. I definitely, as a scientist, I'm not going to like stake my reputation on this conclusion, but I also I don't feel strong enough to flatly reject the possibility that a part of that was you perhaps restoring some of that leptin sensitivity as you kind of stabilized at those lower, more comfortable weights.
I didn't even consider that.
I'm definitely way out on a limb and would never write that down and sign my name on it. But if we're in the land of speculation, I would not be stunned if that could be a possibility.
One of the things I would love to get your opinion on, because again, evolutionary anthropology kind of falls into it. I sometimes get into it with the keto paleo folks because I'm kind of a carbohydrate guy, and for me, I always believe the best diet is the diet that you feel best, that works for you. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't really care what you're eating as long as it's not giving you cancer, God willing. But the thing with the paleo diet and the ketogenic diet for me is twofold. Number one is I feel like when you're modeling, and people debate what they actually ate and what they didn't eat, and that's not what I really mean, but I feel like the kind of stimulus, availability, and palatability of foods that we have today constantly around us, to the point where if you opened like a Big Mac in front of me right now, my brain seeing it and smelling it alone would be like, I might want to eat that very quickly. You know what I'm saying? And I feel like they certainly didn't have that stimulus then, I would imagine. And if they did, I would think that diet would go out the window pretty quickly if they had kind of the external world we have today. The other thing that I kind of challenge about it is like, how long are you going to do this for? Like, legitimately, how long are you not going to eat a carbohydrate for that is so readily available? It's not that your geography doesn't, your region does not provide it. It's like you're saying, I'm going to look at that pasta and not eat it for the rest of my life. I wanted your thoughts on it because this is kind of your area of expertise in some senses.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Ponser wrote a really great paper with Brian Wood in 2021 or 22, where honestly they just said, what exactly is this kind of human, evolutionarily compatible diet? What does that look like? What does a human eat? The same way that if you just like found some new species of mammal in the forest and your first question was, what do you eat? So let's say we just found humans. What do they eat? And the answer is everything except license plates, basically.
Right.
Like, every now and then they pull up a shark out of the ocean and there's like an old tire and a license plate. We're not quite that flexible.
Not yet.
But like, dude, like what they did was they looked at, a ton of different sources of evidence, but some of the most interesting to me is, legitimate records of groups of folks who, again, were hunter-gatherers or subsistence farmers or pastoralists, who basically, just ate what was available in all these different regions of the world, ranging from the Arctic to the rainforest to arid desert type conditions. And the reality is that humans, one thing I will say is, if I were kind of doing a quick redesign, I would try to make it such that, well, it's tough. We're designed pretty well. One flaw from a nutritional perspective is we do need a lot of water. But the reason we need a lot of water is because we are beautifully adapted to deal with heat. And our sweating mechanism is absolutely like a work of brilliance in terms of evolutionary adaptation. So that's a trade-off that it'd be great if we could be a little bit more conservative with how we handle our water without impairing our ability to regulate body temperature. But anyway, water is kind of it's non-negotiable. You need a bunch of water. But outside of that, we see populations that thrive on diets that range from almost fully animal-based to almost fully plant-based in these types of populations. We see essentially negligible carbohydrate intake all the way up to extremely high carbohydrate, like almost exclusively. I mean, obviously you need your fatty acids and your amino acids to live, but yeah, we basically span the spectrum of the lowest carb diet a person would hope to go on and the highest carb diet a person would hope to go on. And so the moral of the story is that an evolutionarily compatible diet really has always been about what do you have access to that actually you can derive nutrients from without poisoning yourself. And the more nutrients you can derive from it, the better in this type of context. But to your point, now, if you were to say, hey, what is, and nature gives us clues about what ought to be good. Like there's a reason that we're attracted to things that have a sweet taste or a savory taste or a salty taste, because those are kind of drawing us toward the nutrients that we need. But now that we've gone in and messed around,
or adipose tissue that's going to keep you from dying during the next famine, right?
Yeah. But now we messed around, and so we can make things that are sweeter than the sweetest thing we would eat in nature, and we can make things that have these incredible, just like perfectly dialed in flavor profiles. So now we're in a position where, based on our lower activity levels, based on the higher availability of food sources, based on the remarkable palatability of those food sources, if we follow what has led us in the right direction for our whole evolutionary history, which is move as much as you need to live, which is a ton, and then just follow things that taste good, because you can only get so many calories out of berries, right?
Right.
Well, nowadays, if we kind of follow those cues, we end up being extremely inactive. We end up eating a lot of highly processed, extremely energetically dense, hyper-palatable foods, and we end up with the type of obesity statistics that we see today.
Yeah, that's absolutely crazy.
Ooh, one fun fact, an interesting thing. Herman wrote another really cool paper. If it's not clear, I have so much respect for Herman. He's really a brilliant guy. I love working with him.
I believe you work in his lab. Am I correct?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. So it's such a fun work environment and such a good educational, scholarly environment there. So couldn't say enough nice things about Herman. But he wrote this other paper within the last year or two where he compared what he called provisioned primates against their less provisioned controls. So the overarching question he had was, it seems like humans, when we're living the good life, which means we don't have to do back-breaking labor and we have plenty of calories around, it seems like we have a tendency broadly to get kind of fat. And it seems like as, different areas of the world over time have become more affluent and have done more of that shift to an industrialized economy model, we see that it's not just like an America thing, it's kind of a human thing. Mm-hmm. And so his question was, well, what if it's not just a human thing? What if it's a primate thing? And so he compared like a hunter-gatherer cohort of humans against, your sedentary American type human. But on top of that, he compared I think a couple dozen different species of primate, and the comparison was, we've got maybe a mouse lemur out in the wild versus a mouse lemur who lives in a cushy sanctuary. and they feed them all the best food, and they get medical care, and they don't have to fight everybody every day. So, and we're talking mouse lemurs, orangutans, all sorts of different primates ranging from the size of a tiny rodent to bigger than a human. And the short version of the results were, that's what primates do. When life is good, we tend to get a little chubby. we tend to take a little bit more than we need, and we do that in perpetuity. And that's why when you look at weight gain rates in humans, aside from there will be situations where, for example, a person goes on a medication that causes increased appetite and they gain a lot of weight rapidly, or there's a psychological driver or an environmental driver, some kind of key change in life that causes precipitous rapid weight gain. But for the majority of people, what we find is a slow, steady weight gain across the adult lifespan. We're talking about 0.8 to 1 kilograms per year. But as you start to drag that out, you say, if I add a kilogram a year of extra fat, all of a sudden by age 55, I'm saying, I think my metabolism is slowed down compared to when I was in college. And it's like, no, it's really just that it adds up slowly and then you recognize it all at once.
That's why I need CRT. That's why I gained all this weight, because or maybe not. Maybe the reason your testosterone's in the toilet is because you gained all that weight. It's kind of not mutually exclusive. Working in metabolism, people are sometimes obsessed with caloric deficits and obviously the larger the deficit, you're going to lose more weight quickly, but diet fatigue is a real thing. And, you probably don't want to lose 0.001 pounds a week either, because that's a really long diet. Has your research ever maybe provided a little bit of a sweet spot where it's like, look, if you hang out around here, you're going to lose some weight and you're hormonally not going to respond negatively so quickly? Have you guys ever found what might be close to a happy balance?
I don't think research is going to really tell you kind of like where exactly to aim for that, but I do think we can get some clues about what seems to be a really big deficit versus a more moderate deficit. But with that type of question, I actually think practicality really steers the ship a lot more than physiology. And so, I recently became a science advisor for Jeremy Etier. He's got a fitness app that just launched in January here. So it's brand new, but ton of work went into it. And like I said, I just kind of recently joined on as a science advisor. But
that's terrific.
As we were kind of wrestling with that type of question, it's like, well, what kind of a weight loss goal would be advisable, And there's certainly physiological elements that you want to incorporate into that type of planning. But one of the kind of practical things, like you said, I don't know if I could really in good conscience tell anyone who's not a bodybuilder 2 weeks out or 4 weeks out. Like, in the 99% of circumstances, I can't fathom recommending telling someone to lose less than half a pound a week.
Right.
Just in the sense that, like, we got to be getting somewhere, right? So half a pound a week is a pound every 2 weeks, is 2 pounds a month. It almost becomes hard to track your progress when you're going much slower than that. So to me, that's about as slow as I would ever recommend for somebody, purely based on practicality. On the other hand, when you start getting, I don't really care how much you weigh. If you start going much beyond like 2 pounds a week, the daily deficit that you have to achieve starts to get crazy. So large.
Yeah.
And it gets to the point where it's like, I don't care how much fat you have to lose. I don't care what you weigh. There's just not a lot of people where if you actually crunch the numbers and say, okay, here's the diet we're going to give you to actually create that deficit. So this is where the physiology comes in, where you start to say, okay, we've got 9,400 calories per kilogram of fat mass, and we got like 14-ish hundred or 1,800 calories per kilogram of fat-free mass, and how much of each will be lost, or how will the two change over time. So there is a lot of science behind it, and you start crunching the numbers, but the end result is that you hand that diet to somebody, and if they're a smaller body, they're just like, well, that's not even like a human diet. Like, that's
where's
terrible.
all my food?
Yeah, but even for folks who are much larger and have higher daily energy expenditure, just by virtue of their body size, I still just rarely find instances where I'm telling anyone to lose more than 2 pounds a week. So essentially, that kind of confines you to this very workable range where it just becomes a matter of, what is your preference, and then also how adamant are you about maintaining as much muscle mass as possible? Because there is some research indicating that, the larger we go with the deficit, the higher the risk of muscle loss during a diet. The meta-regression that is most commonly pointed to suggests that you probably don't want your deficit to be too much higher than about 500 calories a day.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is a very rough approximation, but that for most people ends up putting you somewhere in the ballpark of about a pound a week.
Yeah.
Which is that's usually my kind of sweet spot, which has been the sweet spot, for many, many years. If you just go back and look at like a generic weight loss argument from 2004 or a weight loss article from 2004, it'll just say, lose a pound a week and, have at it, have fun,
Because I think, that's something that you may notice, but it may not totally derail you, where you're just like, you can't do it, where it's a little bit more of that, where maybe more is better is not always more is better. Because we had talked about it a little bit earlier too, like, well, where are you pulling from? Because you don't want to pull the protein, because you're going to lose the muscle real quick if you pull the protein. You start pulling the carbs, and it's like, if your training goes out the window, you're losing the muscle too. Oh yeah, if you pull the fats below a certain point, now your hormones are gone, which also you're losing the muscle because your testosterone's in the toilet. So at some point, like, it's got to come from somewhere, right? I mean, maybe that's a juvenile understanding, but it's just, for me, I'm like, you're going to lose somewhere. One bucket is going to be empty,
Yeah, no, I think once you start to wrestle with those really low intakes, you start making some really substantial sacrifices. You're taken from somewhere, like you said. And that's why I told you, like, I've had scenarios where I'm working with a client and I said, we got to find your number. We got to find your calorie intake that's going to get us on track with that rate of weight loss that you want. And sometimes we find it, we look at the actual diet, we consider what we had to take away from fat or carbohydrate. Rarely do we take away from protein. And sometimes people just say, clearly the best path is to lose weight more slowly with a more sustainable diet. And that often is the right move as people are getting smaller and leaner and just in terms of total body mass. But yeah, I mean, I think with a pound of weight loss per week, it is one of those numbers where it's like, if someone tells me, hey, I want to lose 20 pounds, I say, okay, well, if I told you that was going to take 5 months, does that sound dramatically different from what you had in mind? For me, that sounds like a completely reasonable time frame to lose 20 pounds in 5 months. Absolutely. So that's a pound a week. And if someone said, oh, I don't want to lose 20, I want to lose 50. Like, losing 50 pounds typically is like a year-long process. And if you lose 50 pounds in a year, I don't think I've ever heard from a person who lost 50 pounds in a year and was disappointed at the end of it that they didn't go faster.
Right.
Like that is a very substantial achievement to lose 50 pounds in a year. And I don't care where you started. So yeah, even if we say like, I'm just doing 1 pound a week, that's very substantial. And if you bump that up to 1.5 pounds a week, if you're someone who has a lot more weight to lose, or, like I said, about 2 pounds a week is typically where, just from practical reasons, I start to say, I don't think this is going to go too well.
Right.
But let's say you're doing 2 pounds a week. I mean, there are not that many people who really need to be losing more than 100 pounds a year.
Yeah.
Right? And 2 pounds a week will get you to over 100 pounds a year, 104 pounds a year. So even if you're a person who's, starting, maybe you are 500 pounds, 600 pounds, and you're saying, I want to get down to, 200 pounds. I mean, there's no way that you have in your mind the idea that that's going to be taking, 6 months, right? Like, that we're in for a multi-year effort here. And so, yeah, I think that even in that situation, 2 pounds a week ends up being a pretty sensible target.
Even if I may, even habitually as well, in terms of actual lifestyle and what you're modeling yourself after. I feel like if you were dealing with someone at that weight, you would be wanting to make the smallest change that could become habit and then routine, where it's like, that bottle of soda, I'm sorry, let's make it diet soda, or this thing you're not eating, where that little shift when you're at that, we're gonna walk now, we're gonna try to walk from here to there. I imagine that's a tough weight to walk around at. I'd like to think the smallest changes at that point would probably be so impactful that I can't imagine why you would want to do more than that without the kind of having the snapback effect a little bit. I mean, someone at that size clearly is having maybe a challenge with impulse control. Is that fair to say? I mean,
generally, yeah, or yeah. I mean, that often is the case. But yeah, it's in that type of scenario, I think there's a lot of treatment options on the table, but not necessarily at first, right? So, like for example, we did back when I was at UNC, we did a study on individuals who were undergoing bariatric surgery, gastric bypass surgery. But to qualify for that surgery, you typically have to get under a certain weight level.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, you typically have to. If memory serves, I think the surgeons that we collaborated with were pretty uncomfortable doing the surgeries for people who were much over about like 350 pounds.
I imagine they want to make sure you can survive anesthesia and the surgery, right?
Yeah, the risk of surgical complications goes through the roof.
Wow.
Once you
I didn't
get
know that.
well beyond that weight. So yeah, it's a whole process, and so like there's definitely the kind of, you could imagine a scenario where someone says, "Hey, I'm at 600 pounds and I want to get down to 200." You can imagine this kind of multi-step approach where at first there's I don't know if that kind of weight is a contraindication for GLP-1 agonists, but perhaps you use that to facilitate some of that kind of neurophysiological element of appetite regulation. Like you said, impulse control is I think, one of the reasons I kind of like bristled at just saying categorically yes is not because you're wrong, but because I think a lot of people misunderstand the connotation of impulse control when we talk about food. I think when you talk about impulse control in the context of food and appetite regulation, some people misconstrue it as like a character flaw of Absolutely. Like you're an impulsive person who can't manage your emotions and thoughts and urges. Impulse control when it comes to food seems to be completely dictated by neurophysiological parameters that are essentially out of your control. You can try to do things like cognitive behavioral therapy to overcome, kind of that natural neurophysiological wiring. I would argue that, well, I shouldn't argue because I'm not a clinician, but it seems to me that the best approach would be a combination of something resembling cognitive behavioral therapy and, some type of agonist or co-agonist weight loss medication to work on the physiological side. But you could imagine a trajectory where someone starts with that stuff, they lose 2 pounds a week for a very long time, get into, maybe they decide they want to do bariatric surgery. Once they get within the safe range, they do that as well. And we could see a multi-year process where someone successfully does go from 600 pounds to 200 pounds and dramatically extends their lifespan.
Just to add to it a little bit, Dr. Crystal Guevara was on the show a few weeks ago, and we talked a lot about the GLP-1s and stuff like that, her experiences and stuff like that. And again, with the hunger signaling, to your point, it's not a matter of character. That is, really the primary, I think, client for those drugs. Not to say you should or shouldn't take the drug if not, because that's not my business, but in general, I think that the hunger signaling, like she talks a lot about her experience, and it's like, it doesn't matter if I'm at maintenance, I could physically feel full and still be hungry. And I think in those senses, your point, we actually talked about bariatric surgery on the show, and she was saying that she thinks people need, in some cases, psychological evaluation before you're cutting out some of your stomach. That's a pretty big step, not reversible.
It's a pretty big step, and there definitely are a lot of folks who do regain the weight because, the stomach can kind of re-expand with chronic overfeeding. So yeah, it's a surgery that's not to be taken lightly by any means, and it's also a surgery that cannot be misconstrued as a kind of a, rock solid solution that cannot fail. That's not what the literature would indicate. So yeah, I do think you really do need a multi-pronged approach, and I am a little bit curious to see how dramatically rates of gastric bypass and bariatric surgery are going to drop now that we have the new class of drugs. I imagine those surgeries are going to be far less prevalent.
My next question for you was, if I'm at 350 and I need to get to 300 and Mounjaro, Wegovy, Ozempic is helping me get there, as a responsible doctor, am I kind of like, hey, before I cut out the rest of your stomach, perhaps we want to continue on this course? I mean, is that...
Yeah, that would be my expectation, because I mean, a lot of times, what they're trying to get at with this with these different forms of bariatric surgery is they're trying to essentially tweak, perceived hunger and satiety and fullness by ultimately restricting the volume of the stomach. So a very tiny meal with fewer calories, certainly gives the sensation of being much more full. However, the fact that we do see a lot of scenarios where people after bariatric surgery seem to overeat chronically to an extent that expands their stomach, and then once it expands back, you're able to take in the level of calories you used to, and then weight regain happens. I think that really points to the fact that a lot of people who overeat, it sounds like Crystal was probably getting at this a little bit, but it's not necessarily physiological hunger.
Absolutely,
that causes a lot of overeating. There's
anecdotally her experience as well. Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of overeating that we kind of have to. The way I like to talk about it as a researcher is I kind of separate the concepts of like hunger, appetite, and desire to eat. And I think desire to eat is one of those things that is not really addressed very well by bariatric surgery. And so you have someone who's kind of like always thinking about food, and their neurophysiological reward system as it pertains to food stimuli is like really, really amplified, where they're thinking about food all day. When they do have some good tasting food, it really lights up that signal. I think those folks are kind of those candidates where you'd think probably a pharmacological approach is going to be much more suitable than a surgical approach, if I had to guess as a non-medical doctor.
Yeah, I might even crudely say, like, you hear the term emotional eater. Well, I don't know what category I fall into, but I definitely have had life events happen to me where I'm just on the couch like, I think that's almost like a little bit of a human response, because you're going to get a certain signal out of that bag of Doritos that I don't even bring in the house now. I think it's a very human thing, and I think for some people, for that signaling to maybe not be as in sync as it is for maybe someone else, it's reasonable to me. But again, I'm not a doctor, so I mean, someone might tell me, no, that's wrong because this states that.
And you might wonder, like, why have we as a species evolved with this, what appears to be a fairly prevalent predisposition among some individuals to just kind of be wired to, fairly substantial overeating, So why would we have this kind of variation where some people, that reward system and that impulse control, all those other factors of the neurophysiological determinants of desire to eat are out of whack? And I would suggest personally, you're probably about to say this, I would suggest it's never been a problem until now.
I think I'm going to kind of pose that in the form of a question to you. Is it possible that evolutionarily, regionally, you came from a people that had a tough time surviving, and now you are programmed to? I mean, could it possibly be an evolutionary thing where certain genetics came from a people that just did not survive? The food was maybe not as plentiful in certain regions.
It's possible.
Don't sign your name on it, but if you did, come on. You're saying there's a chance.
It's possible, but I think one of the things is like there's really not a direct evolutionary benefit of a really tightly controlled system that keeps us lean. Like there just isn't. There may be, in the scenarios you mentioned, an evolutionary benefit of just grazing when food's around, like just saying, might as well get a little bit heavier than I should, which is probably why we see on average, just like I was talking about with Herman's paper, if you're a primate and food's around, you're probably going to eat more than you need, and you're probably going to store some of that energy, and that'll come in handy. But a lot of people wonder, like, well, why do we have this, what is in modern days viewed as this kind of unfavorable lingering trait that is so prevalent, where we are eating to an extent, overeating to an extent that is frankly limiting our lifespan? And the answer is evolution doesn't care about your vanity. It doesn't care necessarily about helping you live to be 110. Evolution is purely about surviving to the age of reproduction and then having reproductive success. So like, this is an interesting time in human history, because a lot of our medical concerns that we discuss apply to what happens in the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th decade of life. And evolution, frankly, doesn't care that much about what's happening,
Such a great point.
Beyond like the 4th decade of life. So yeah, it's a fascinating place we find ourselves in as a species, where some of the traits that, like you said, may have been really favorable to us in terms of being able to store energy during the feast so we can more successfully weather the famine. Now we find ourselves in a position where it's all feast, no famine. And while that's a wonderful place to be, that's like the ultimate evolutionary success, it also is quite frankly directly limiting our lifespans in the modern era.
And that's we kind of touched on it earlier too, when we were talking about the whole paleo diet. In theory, I have no problem with the paleo diet. I did it for years. I'm saying you're introducing so much stimulus here that if we can find a way to find healthier varieties or whole grains or more foods that are more satiating, or really leaning on fiber a little bit to feel like, hey, I'm getting some of that, but maybe not the worst of it. I just feel like your health span and you're going to be better off than a life of trying to deprive yourself to, again, are you going to do it forever? And most people I talk to who went on these ketogenic, paleo, carnivore diets, it's always, oh yeah, I did it for a while, I fell off, I'm going to start doing it again. Or I'm doing it. How long have you been doing it for? About 4 weeks. I'm like, I mean, I don't know that many people that have done it for 2, 5, 10, 15 years. Not saying they can't or they won't. If they do, I think that's fantastic. I just see so much trouble with the stimulus out there. It's
Yeah, and if I may, but just a direct plea to your audience. If you decide that you want to go one of these routes, if you want to do a ketogenic diet, there are ways to create and formulate a completely suitable ketogenic diet. If you want to do a paleo diet, you're probably going to be on a pretty well-rounded diet. It may have extra restrictions that you don't need, but that's probably going to look like a fantastic diet. But don't do the no fiber, no vegetable carnivore diet.
That's crazy.
It's just because we don't know everything about nutrition doesn't mean we don't know anything. And two of the things that we can feel most strongly about in terms of health and longevity is that it turns out high fiber, nutrient-rich vegetables are actually good for you.
Why does the world, or a portion of the world, hate oatmeal now? When did that happen?
I don't know. Probably because there's, quote unquote anti-nutrients in it, which are essentially irrelevant once you cook it.
Now again, I probably can't read all the research quite as well as you, but everything I have read that has associated oatmeal with anything has not been mortality.
Oatmeal is a staple in the diet of numerous extremely healthy people. I haven't looked at the the food specific epidemiology, but I would be absolutely stunned to find a single negative association, provided that you're not doing, 1 part oatmeal and 8 parts honey or syrup.
Oh my God, absolutely.
Yeah, but
no, they're going after the oatmeal and the fiber. It's crazy.
Yeah, oatmeal is fantastic, and there's really not much more to say about it. So if you want to do one of the diets that kind of falls in that naturally grouped triad of diets, if you want to do keto, go for it. Just make sure that you're getting some fibrous vegetables. You have carbs to play with. Just make sure you use them wisely. If you want to go paleo, paleo is honestly kind of hard to mess up in terms of just putting together a decent diet.
Right.
And yeah, just the carnivore stuff, there's just no need for it. And especially when you see that, it is important to recognize that while I believe it's true that overall cancer mortality and cancer prevalence, or I think overall cancer mortality is either flat or kind of dropping for people in their younger years of life. Gastric cancers seem to be on the rise, especially for people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Interesting.
So seeing a lot of folks who are in that age range who are deciding to go on complete fiberless diets, eating a bunch of charred meats and processed meats, it's like you're literally doing what you would do if you were trying as hard as possible to get a gastric cancer.
Wow.
At a time where we seem to be seeing them go up.
Saturated fat through the roof.
Yeah, so it's it's a very troubling trend to observe, and it's weird to me that has become it's not controversial, but it'll get you flack to just say hey, vegetables are good, fiber is good, and you should eat them. But
I feel like, for me, I know I made a joke earlier, but I feel like TRT is the same thing now. It's like, what are you on today? You take your creatine and your TRT, right? It's like, TRT is not a supplement. This isn't something you just take and again, if you're choosing to take performance enhancing drugs, I'm not looking down to anyone, but please don't put my whey protein, my creatine, and my TRT in the same sentence. I mean, there are young kids right now, particularly males, females too, that may not be able to have kids one day because they don't know what the hell they're doing. And the thing that really pisses me off too, I'm sorry, I'm going on a small tangent here, is you get a celebrity that comes out there. They go on cycle, they go off cycle, they go to the doctor, and 6 weeks later, would you know it, their testosterone's in the toilet. They needed TRT. That's the reason. And it's like, dude, don't go out there when kids are watching you and say, we know where you got the low test level from. You were off cycle, I get it, but now you see kids today, and I see some of these YouTubers, whatever they are, where it's like a normal thing, and I'm maybe aging myself or dating myself a little bit. I've never seen it like this before.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting trend, and it's just like anything else, any kind of medical intervention. If you're going to go that route, it's important to understand the pros and cons, the risks and benefits, and to simply know what you're signing up for.
Right.
I think, I've always been comfortable knowing that people will make decisions I don't make. So even when people go well beyond TRT and get into super physiological testosterone ranges in the interest of sport or body composition or whatever, I've never judged it. I've just always hoped that for the people who do kind of glamorize the lifestyle of having a gram a week of exogenous testosterone, it's like, please make sure if you're kind of talking about how good it is for you, make sure that impressionable people in your audience also understand that and they should know what they're signing up for if they try to emulate that, which is potentially fertility issues, potentially prostate issues, potentially cardiac issues, and most likely, especially when you're pushing into those very super physiological levels, probably a lifetime of TRT.
One of the things, to your point, that I love so much about Dr. Mike Israetel, who's on the show too, is coming at that with such a level of, I feel, responsibility, candor, and transparency, where, I admire that so much in him, because you don't get that from everyone. and you get a lot of glamorization. And I think the way he speaks about it, I don't know that I've ever heard anyone speak about it before like that. So,
Yeah.
respect from me anyway.
Yeah, I agree.
So, I want to do the GOAT lightning round with you. This is a quick one, the GOAT.
Okay.
And you're gonna, oh no, he's like, you gotta kid, you kidding me? Real quick one.
I'm intrigued.
This is just our guest. We like to ask them. Part of the GOAT lightning round is kind of, what do you think the best is? And this is just kind of fun stuff.
Okay.
So first thing of the GOAT is, who is the most influential person who has participated in your career in science? Doesn't have to be a famous person, but who's the GOAT to you that has really been most impactful?
I would say John Speakman. Yeah.
All right.
In science, yeah.
Excellent. Number 2, what is your favorite exercise? It does not have to induce the most hypertrophy or strength, but what do you enjoy doing the most? What's the GOAT?
Ooh, boy.
Good question.
Man, that's really, really tough.
Talk science for 2 hours. What's your favorite exercise? Like, damn, got you.
I would say right now it's probably the hack squat.
That's cool. Yeah. That is cool. I like that. I mean, you're not walking the next day if I'm doing them, but yeah, that's really cool. I do not like the word cheat food. I don't really like the connotation of it. I'm a flex diety kind of guy, but
right.
What is your favorite thing to eat if you just don't give a Funko Pop, you're going to town?
That's easy. I'm a pizza guy. I know it's cliche, but like, yeah.
What are we talking? Sicilian, regular, buffalo chicken? What do you eat them?
I'm pretty simple. I mean, I'm currently vegetarian, so just a nice like margarita pizza or cheese pizza, or even like they make a really good Greek one around here that's got like olives and it's good.
We eat a lot of Greek in my house. I would like to try that. Sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it's good.
So I'm going to ask you this one, but there's a connotation. I want to know your favorite workout jam, but Helms has sent me his like gangster rap mix, and I have trained to it. And it's really, really good. So if you were to say Helms's gangster rap mix, I would not be surprised.
All right, so this might make me seem very odd. I listen exclusively to podcasts while training.
Wow.
I don't really listen to music, and they're never fitness oriented.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it'll be a podcast that's about, it could be about science, technology, psychology, news and politics, anything that's basically not fitness.
That's really, really cool. I'm really surprised to hear that, but you're the first person who's ever been like, no music. So that's...
Yeah, the problem with me is I do not like training. There's kind of that like inverted U shape when it comes to like arousal and performance. I need something that's going to make me not bored during rest periods, and I don't need any help getting to the high part of that arousal curve. So if I listen to really amped up music, or music that just kind of puts me in like a flow state where I don't want to like take a rest period, all I end up doing is skipping my rests and having a crappy workout, or just feeling really jittery and amped up to the point of almost like discomfort. So yeah, I like something that's actually going to chill me out and give me a good reason to rest for 90 seconds.
That's super interesting. I have not heard that before. Will you ever compete in bodybuilding again, do you think? Is that have any interest in doing it again, or do you have any plans?
I'm not ready to say I will never do it again, but it is really far down on my list of priorities, and I'm just now coming back from a very long layoff due to injury and surgery. So it's like that's not even close in my mind. Yeah.
I hear you, man. Well, Dr. Trexler, thank you so much for being here today. Where can people find you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, I mean, the best place is over at massresearchreview.com.
Yes.
On top of that, we do the Iron Culture podcast every week. You'll find it on YouTube and all the big podcast platforms. And then if you want to talk to me specifically, I'm on Instagram at Trexler Fitness.
Everyone in the audience, please check him out. Again, Mass Research Review, I cannot say enough good things about. Dr. Trexler, I hope you will come speak with me again. And thank you so much for being that. You're coming back. We're scheduling it. This was fantastic, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.